British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and U.S. President Joe Biden have held talks in Washington on whether to allow Ukraine to fire British-made cruise missiles into Russia. This comes as the Kremlin ramps up threatening language over the use of Western weapons by Kyiv.
Britain's Prime Minister arrives at the White House for key talks on the Ukraine war. Keir Starmer is pressing U.S. President Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles on targets inside Russia. But Biden fears that could spark a major escalation with Russia. Still, he reaffirmed his commitment to Ukraine.
I want to thank you for the UK's leadership in this front. The United States is committed to standing with you to help Ukraine as it defends against Russia's onslaught and aggression. Putin will not prevail in this war, and the people of Ukraine will prevail.
Starmer is seeking a united strategy on Ukraine from the West.
It's really important as great allies, that special relationship, to have this time to talk about the global issues you have just identified, starting, of course, with Ukraine, where I think the next few weeks and months could be crucial. Very, very important that we support Ukraine in this vital war of freedom.
Ukraine has long been asking its allies for permission to use weapons like these British Storm Shadow missiles on targets deep inside Russia. Kyiv says they're crucial for destroying Russian warplanes used for launching guided glide bombs toward Ukraine. But at a UN Security Council meeting, Russia warned that a red line would be crossed.
If the decision to lift restrictions is really taken, that will mean that from that moment, NATO countries are conducting direct war with Russia. In this case, we will have to, as you understand, make relevant decisions with all the consequences that the Western aggressors would incur.
No announcement on the missiles was made during Starmer's trip to the White House. But with Biden's term drawing to a close and winter approaching on the battlefield, Britain and Ukraine are hoping for decisive action.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in military analyst Marina Miron from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Marina, tell us why Western countries have been resisting urgent calls from Ukraine to ease restrictions on the use of longer-range weapons and why it's been taking them so long to make a decision.
Good day, Marianne. Well, what we have to understand is that there are practical implications in terms of the inventories of the missiles that Ukraine has at its disposal, such as Storm Shadow / Scalp, as well as ATACMS. And those inventories are limited. In order to make a difference, Ukraine would need quite a lot of those missiles. And specifically, Scalp and Storm Shadow are quite expensive. The second issue with this is that involves NATO providing the targeting data. More specifically, it's American navigational data that would be used. This is why the UK is asking the US for permission to employ Storm Shadow for long-range strikes into Russian territory. And obviously, there are also political considerations in terms of a potential escalation. As one UK diplomat put it, if Putin has drawn all these red lines and he hasn't done anything about it, doesn't mean that he will not do it now. So we shouldn't push him. So there is a sense that it's going to make matters worse in terms of the war in Ukraine and for broader geopolitical landscape. This is perhaps why German Chancellor Scholz said that Russia should be attending a peace summit in November and that we should rekindle a diplomatic solution to the war.
Well, you mentioned these threats from Moscow, and we've been hearing President Zelensky urging his Western allies just to ignore these so-called red lines, as Russia has been saying. What are the real risks and benefits of adopting this kind of strategy?
Well, on the one hand, in terms of risks, of course, there is a lot of talk about Russia potentially using a tactical nuclear weapon, specifically on Ukrainian territory, but some even believe that Russia might go as far as use it on one of European capitals. However, there are other options, so it's not black and white in terms of what Russia could do as a response, aside from a heavy military response targeting Ukrainian cities. It's also acting globally in terms of sharing important military technologies with actors that are hostile to the West and specifically to NATO. And that includes countries like Iran, North Korea, but also groups like Ansar Allah, Houthis in Yemen, who are complicating the situation in the Red Sea. Could include potentially Hamas and Hezbollah as well. So there are a lot of actors whom Russia could support, as well as acting, say, economically, restricting the export of enriched uranium, which would affect specifically the United States, the companies which have current contracts with Russia, and in the informational spectrum with the upcoming elections in the United States. So there might be interference as well, as we have seen in the past. So there are quite a lot of tools that Russia can and probably will use.
All right, so there are a variety of risks to the Western nations for allowing these long-range missiles, but how important are they to Ukraine? They can already strike targets in Russia using drones. Do they really need these missiles if it's such a huge risk to the West?
Well, it's a huge risk to the West, and it's also questionable whether these missiles are going to end the war. And the answer to it is probably no, not in the quantities that Ukraine has them, and not the kind of missiles that Ukraine has, namely the Storm Shadow and ATACMS. And if we look at military history, deep strikes have never compelled the adversary to capitulate. And in this case, Ukraine would need more deep strike systems in order to make a difference, or at least to affect the battlefield configuration. But as of now, the Russians are already warned that there might be this decision taken in order to allow Ukraine to strike within that range. So nothing important is located within that range anymore. Yes, it will be unpleasant probably if they strike the airfield, but it's not going to change the dynamics.
That was Marina Miron, military analyst from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Thanks for all your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Let's unpack this with journalist and military expert Thomas Wiegold. Thomas, welcome to DW. What do you make first of the delay in taking a decision on this?
Well, the impression is that the delay is mostly, if not exclusively, on the U.S. side. And quite obviously, the President, Joe Biden, has problems or has a fear that Russia indeed might escalate beyond what it has done so far. On the other hand, it's a bit strange, what I really can't make sense of at this point in time, when the UK is asking for US approval. On the other hand, where's France? France Scalp cruise missiles are technically almost the same as the British Storm Shadow. So you would expect that France would also be part of the discussion, but it isn't.